And we welcome everyone joining us on the Stingers Up Sacramento State Football Podcast. I'm Jason Ross. It has been a tough year for your Sacramento State Hornet football program, as last week they were on the road in Bozeman and literally got run over. The Bobcats had a field day on the ground. The Hornets had a tough day and ended up with another loss to the number 2 ranked team in the nation. The Hornets came in injury depleted, suffered a big-time loss, and now have just 2 games remaining on their schedule, including their final road game of the year this weekend against Cal Poly, and then they'll close it out with the Causeway Classic at Hornet Stadium the following Saturday. Now, this week on the podcast, thought I would try something a little bit different because there's a lot going on, a lot of rumors, a lot of things swirling around at the Sacramento State football program. We've already talked during the podcast this year about the future with the stadium and all the things that entails, but there's still more conference talk about the Big Sky. Will they stay in the Big Sky? Will they go to the Mountain West? Will they go to the Pac-12? But also just the ever-changing landscape of college football and college sports with NIL and collectives and just different things that are happening right now, not only at Sac State, but all across the college landscape. And so this week, I had a chance to check in and catch up with Chris Schomman, who is the executive director of the Hornet Collective. Now, his company is First Team Sports Consulting. He also has a few other schools as well that he is partnered with and shares the collective part with, and that is SMU, St. Mary's, San Jose State, to name a few others. And so I started my conversation with Chris about kind of, like I said, where's the future for Sacramento State, about the Big Sky staying there, whether it's the Pac-12, whether it is Mountain West, and any other things out there. But we cover a lot of stuff here. But I started by asking about that very premise. What is the Hornet Collective?
Well, I appreciate the time and a great question in that we've been doing this name, image, and likeness part of college sports here for 3 years, and prior to that 3-year marker, the notion of a collective was certainly not something that was even conceptualized. A collective, for ease of everyone's understanding, is an aggregation of donors or contributors to the NIL effort. It is an arm's length entity established to support, in this case, Sac State student athletes, but it is not an entity that is either owned or controlled by the institution itself. So think of a booster club, if you will, that is incorporated as a limited liability corporation. The sole purpose of that entity is to engage in name, image, and likeness deals and relationships with, in this case, Sac State student athletes.
So, hearing that, I'm thinking back to, younger days for me. You've been in college sports forever. You would hear about stories like, oh, there's money funneling here, there's money funneling there, and they're trying to keep it away from certain people and out of the school's hands. In this case, why did it kind of not go through the school? Why is there your company, the First Team Sports Consulting kind of group, this collective, separate than the school, if you will? Why has this kind of been the established, and this is all new for a lot of schools, but why is this kind of the route this is going?
The route was dictated early on by what small group of rules and regulations the NCAA had with respect to NIL. And the bright lights top line rule was that the institution could not be involved with name, image, and likeness deals. That has ebbed over time to where, starting this coming August, in August of 2025, institutions will be able to share in the revenue derived from the institution or the athletics department with their own student athletes. There are some schools, Jason, that are bringing that program in-house, and then there are other schools that are going to continue to operate in the same vein as we're operating the Hornet Collective, as an outside, independent, arm's-length entity that again, is designed, in that case, to process NIL deals as well as revenue share agreements.
So my question on the follow-up here, Chris, is, okay, I'm a Hornet supporter, and let's say I like the football program and, I don't know, gymnastics, but I want to give money to an offensive lineman. I want to give money to a gymnast. Does that, when I contact you or get in this aggregate, is my money going specifically to said one athlete? Is it going to the program? How does that all get dispersed?
It is in terms of support. I find it still a little distasteful that the supporter in that instance has in effect bought or rented, or however we would describe it, an individual student athlete. I just don't like that particular notion. But I do have relationships that I've created for folks either through their business for the most part, wherein they might support an athlete and the athlete in turn supports the business that the contributor is putting the money into the collective for. So let's say that lineman goes out and serves as a product spokesperson for that contributor's corporate entity. It's a win for the corporate entity because they can book that contribution as advertising and marketing for their entity, and that way it creates a little bit more of a professional relationship between the athlete and the contributor as well.
Yeah, this is so fascinating because it's really in its infancy. And, it is I agree with you where it kind of feels a little bit odd where you'd hope you just support a school, a program. But we know in this business, it's like, hey, if I can get that 5-star recruit that's a two-way corner and receiver to my school that I support, like doesn't this feel such like a big bidding process for, like, if we're talking like the major programs?
It's become that. I mean, I think you've seen there have been published reports that, one of the University of Michigan's larger contributors, he has made no bones about the fact that he's willing to give, more than $1 million on behalf of the search for a certain high school prospect quarterback. So yes, it has become part of. It's certainly become part of the fabric of college athletics, but it's become as much of a contributor toward a program's success as the conference that they play in, the sneakers that they wear, the facilities that they play in, the academic support and degree of the. So NIL has become as important as any of those individual attributes now in terms of the athlete making the selection out of high school, going and looking at students who may be fifth-year graduate transfers. Sometimes, Jason, it really just comes down to, okay, well, what's the NIL number? I mean, I've seen fifth-year grad students who never even visited the campus before they agreed to come in and, play a football season or play a basketball season during their grad school year.
That's amazing. I mean, it seemed like there was a time where it was like, obviously I felt like the head coach was the figurehead. That was as big of a reason. But what's my opportunity? And now that opportunity is less maybe about playing time, Chris. It could be about the financial opportunity, right?
Correct.
Wow. Just amazing. So there are levels to this. Obviously, you referenced Michigan. That's a good reference point. Sac State is not Michigan. But what are we looking at if we were talking collective comparison? So this is money, the aggregate you're talking about, NIL money for a campus like Sac State. I know you do stuff with San Jose State, St. Mary's, SMU. So what are we talking numbers-wise, or just the overall pot of what we're looking at a school like Sacramento State?
Well, what you're trying to look at is Jason, not necessarily putting out a target figure, but more getting a sense, with my work with coaches and with athletics directors in understanding, kind of what the market bears, because the market for that lineman that you referenced is going to be different in the Big Sky as it would be in the potential of Pac-12 or Mountain West membership for Sac State. And that's going to be different than that lineman's value, if you will, at Michigan. So there are metrics that we utilize in order to kind of come up with, okay, well, what would it take us to give to give a little bit of an answer to that question, once we go into revenue sharing here in August of 25, the salary cap, if you will, for an institution at that high end will be $20.5 million. And so institutions would work with entities like ours or others, or would do this themselves in order to figure out the distributions amongst the sports that the institution sponsors, and then be responsible for monitoring that salary cap. And there are certain exemptions that the cap has built in, like real NIL, like Alston educational awards and other pieces here that wouldn't necessarily count against the $20.5 million. But you're in effect operating, a quasi-professional sports team moving forward once we get into August this upcoming summer.
Who set that cap number? Is that an NCAA thing? Are they out of it? Like, who put that number out there? Who's policing it?
The cap number was set. The cap number is derived out of the preliminary settlement in a court case in federal court in California, House versus the NCAA. And House and the other members of the House class had enjoined the NCAA for what was in effect back pay. That NIL came on to the landscape after their eligibility had been exhausted. And that case was settled. There is a back pay pool of resources that was established for those student athletes to make a claim as a member of the class. And then part of the settlement moving forward to potentially avoid future litigation was that a cap, if you will, was calculated. Initially, it was set at $22 million. It was revised for year one down to $20.5 million. And I believe there's 4 years worth of future caps that have been published for institutions to plan around.
I'm thinking, as we're talking with Chris Schomman, Executive Director of the Hornet Collective, and you're in other universities as well. Chris, is this a fair parallel when I'm thinking about Sacramento State? So being around this program, hearing coaches like going through recruiting, and in the Big Sky, for example, it's really tough for them to find a 6'3", fast corner, long arms, just because that player likely is getting, recruited by Alabama, UCLA, pick your school. So it's tough to get that guy, but they'll find the undersized 5'10" player that can really play corner. They wish he was 6'2", 6'3". But is it similar in that NIL part? Like, hey, this is almost in a recruiting area. Like, if we can get this Hornet player to agree to X amount of dollars, we might be able to get them, even though they might be able to get more money somewhere else. Are there any parallels there, or is that a stretch?
No, there are absolute parallels, certainly on the initial evaluation and initial signing of that athlete at the Big Sky level. The problem area, Jason, is what we see that has a detrimental effect on the Big Sky type institution is the fact that young person gets recruited and competes at a high level for a Sac State, and then all of a sudden Alabama comes calling and says, hey, this is the dude we want. We're going to go ahead and offer X. And unfortunately, the Big Sky-based institutions can't keep up with whatever number would be required to retain that athlete. Yeah. And that's where the inequity in this comes into play, because the resources just aren't there at the Big Sky level yet. They may never be there, but certainly not right now. And so one of the frustrations that mid-major basketball coaches and FCS football coaches have had is that, well, wait a minute, I bring this guy in and I'm in effect just training him or her, in somewhat of a minor league capacity, so that they ultimately may go to the Power 4 level. Some coaches have embraced that a little bit, but others find that to be hard in terms of the roster turnover and roster management. When you look at 2024, especially in the sport of men's basketball, that's become very hard. You've got institutions with 9 new players this year because of the portal and because of NIL. The roster turnover is very dramatic, especially in men's college basketball right now.
Yeah, we're definitely witnessing that. And just to kind of tie it to our Hornet listeners, they know just a couple years ago, Chris Hornets had a all-conference player. In fact, Big Sky Offensive Player of the Year, Cameron Scadaboo. He was a stud his freshman year, all-conference the second year, and the conference Player of the Year. And he's been great now the last 2 years at Arizona State. So it's like they recruited him, they found him, he was local, they developed him, and there's kind of no safeguard or protection. You just hope maybe with the love of being at your school and building those relationships, I guess, that you can keep a player like that, because in that sense, what you're describing, it almost feels a little bit like there is no protection. It's the haves and the have-nots in some sense.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I do think NIL in some cases has been a leveler, if you will, of the playing field. I think you can look at Vanderbilt in football this year in terms of their success. Up until NIL, I don't know whether there was a direct correlation there, but up until NIL came on the scene, Vanderbilt was not as competitively successful in the SEC as they have been certainly this season. You mentioned SMU, which is one of my institutions. I think at NIL at SMU, you would be asleep at the switch if you didn't recognize the fact that because we have had as good of a level of contribution as anybody in the country there, we've been able to, build rosters where, we haven't just gone out and overpaid. We've been very pragmatic and very thoughtful in terms of saying, okay, well, here's Jason, this 6'3" corner that you're talking about here, and trying to look at it in terms of recruiting the athlete, not just necessarily offering a contract to the athlete. And I'm not saying by any means that that's Pollyanna in terms of thinking that the NIL compensation that we're offering there isn't meaningful. It is, but I do think you can still kind of do it with some care, regardless of what level, and care and communication between my role and the head football coach or the head women's and men's basketball coach is absolutely necessary, in order to try to have that concept of general manager or whatever you might refer to it on the pro end. That works hand in glove in terms of the building of those rosters across the country.
So, Chris, I got to ask you then about the differences here. There's a lot of talk here about, and I know you know about it, Sacramento State and a potential move. They're at the FCS level. They've done some good things there, and there's talk about a stadium coming. That part's all happening, but there's been a literal buzz, and pardon the pun, for Pac-12, which there's a group here locally, the Sac-12, that's really trying to gather support there. Mountain West conversations, maybe even other conferences potential at the FBS level. How much of a game changer would it be in your specific department, or would need to happen in your specific department, if Sacramento State did get that invite to the Pac-12, to the Mountain West, or another FBS conference?
Well, I think the game changer analogy would be perhaps underselling, what would the end result would be for the Hornet Collective, because we have had and are having open discussions with a number of the members of that group, wherein they have pledged significant sums of money to support the program if there was an offer of entry into the Pac-12 for certain. My role in those discussions has been to make sure that those folks realize that, hey, entry into the Mountain West, as you alluded to, perhaps even the Conference USA or the American Conference, depending on how far west that footprint goes. I wouldn't look at any of those as being, a negative or a failure with respect to FBS membership for Sac State. And, yeah, I think your reference of how that particular piece has kind of galvanized that Sac-12 group and the Sacramento community. I think it's amazing and certainly shows, again, the power of being able to utilize athletics for the betterment of community, for the betterment of the institution, and try to really create a different position in terms of what that reputational aspect of the Sac State program would become, because it's certain that reputational part of who they are and who they've been. And I think that brand is respected not only across the Big Sky, but nationally. And so here, this would be that next logical step, if that's what, President Wood and Mark Orr and his team, want to go ahead and pursue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you gave that SMU reference earlier, and if they're living near the top of that range, it shows that, they're not traditionally thought of as Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, but that's pretty significant what you were able to do there. And if anything like that could live around here in Sacramento, I'd love to see where that could take this program, if that's in the Big Sky still, but certainly if they jumped up to the Pac-12 Mountain West or another conference. I don't know what it would look like, but I'd love to see what that would look like.
It'd be exciting for certain.
Yeah. In your time doing this, you've been involved in college sports a long time. I think some people thought we might get here. Once we finally did, it's really fast-tracked. I don't know if it's better or not for the sport. Do you have an opinion on – it's what we're in, so it's our reality. You have to adapt. Do you think it's your own opinion, better or worse, that we're kind of living in this now?
I'm a middle child by birth, and so I'm going to give kind of a middle child's answer. I think it's a little bit of both. I think, like you referenced, I've been an administrator after I coached, in college sports, for over 30 years now, and so I don't think I ever envisioned signing a basketball athlete to a $1 million NIL deal or a revenue sharing deal. That said, I spent 20 years representing schools on NCAA compliance and infractions cases, and it certainly seems silly that we spent time looking at cases where I may have hired you, Jason, to house sit for my house, and I may have paid you, $200 a day to do that, and the going rate for that was $75, and I as the booster or I as the coach, amassed an NCAA violation against my school or had a violation that had competitive restrictions placed on the athlete that I gave that benefit to. In retrospect, those seem kind of pedestrian or silly, as I described. And I akin that to the fact that it certainly makes sense for the athlete to be able to monetize their own name, their own image, and their own likeness. That just seems, like that should have been permissible all along. Does that mean, though, that especially when NIL started, that we can kind of arbitrarily determine what that athlete's NIL value is? No, I don't think that's necessarily a great thing. It's where we are, and it's what we have to manage. But, if we were having a conversation at the local watering hole, that would certainly be my response. Yeah,
and, again, maybe another opinion question. I don't know if you feel like your example, a college basketball athlete, maybe getting $1 million, but that same athlete has every right to then say, thank you, I'm here, I'm enjoying this, but I'm going to X university next year or this university after that. Do you think we will get to or should get to a time where there's a contract attached to that gives some protections and safeguards to that person that said, yeah, I got you here for this $1 million and you're going to leave after that? You think we get to that spot at some point?
Well, I can tell you we're already there. I mean, the contracts that I've been working on here, especially in men's basketball for 2025, 26. So after revenue sharing goes into effect, I have constructed a couple contracts already, Jason, that if they're 2-year deals, they may have liquidated damages in there that if the athlete goes ahead and leaves prior to a certain execution date, the athlete or the second institution is responsible for in effect paying the collective back, whatever that agreed upon figure is. So I think you're seeing much more complex contractual relationships with revenue sharing. The agreements as they relate to NIL are still in some cases complex, but they're not as much akin to players' contracts as what you will see in this space once we move into revenue sharing across the board.
Chris, about one more thing on Sac State. So the Sac-12, as we talked about, they're out there. They're being aggressive. You talked about the impressive pledges that they've got out there, whether those can, materialize into full commitments going forward. But what kind of impact does just the pledging, just kind of that noise that's out there, have in their chances of being in the Pac-12, of the Mountain West? They still need to be invited. They're still an FCS team. There's still some disadvantages that they have. I think they have some advantages too. Just your gut feeling on kind of what they've been able to do so far. What are these things doing to help their future in these other eyes of these other conferences?
Well, I think again, that's a combination. First off, I think that effort in and of itself has done a tremendous amount of name recognition, issue recognition, just in the limited time period since all this has transpired. You got to remember, we're talking about 6-week time period here, wherein this perhaps wasn't even an issue, and now you and I are discussing, kind of the effects that this has had in terms of the attractiveness of the institution. Mark Orr and I, when we met 3 weeks ago with his deputy Andy Fisk, we were kind of joking amongst the three of us. It's not like you just go to the store and you get a number at the deli counter out of the little red machine, and apply to go into the Pac-12. That's not how this works. But I do think that all of these pieces, they all fit and they all are quantified and qualified by the Pac-12 or the Mountain West or whomever's making that decision to say, okay, we need to target this institution here, and we need to target them for the following reasons. In looking at who will be a good partner for us, not necessarily just with Andy Thompson's program or men's and women's basketball or volleyball, but across the board. And is this an institution that shares, the common value? Like for a long time, the Big Ten, and I think even including the schools that they recently added, there were, those were AAU institutions in terms of their research classification. You had real strong faculty athletic representation within those programs, and they all matched a certain set of attributes, if you will, going back from when they added Penn State and Nebraska all the way up through adding the 4 Pac-12 schools. So I think it's not just limited to, okay, well, this school can generate X in terms of potential NIL or rev share income potential, but it's also, there's a competitive analysis, there's a facility analysis, there's all kinds of analyses that go into that. And I think all of those put together put Sac State in as good of a position as anyone, who could potentially make that FCS to FBS jump.
All right, Chris, last thing for you. Maybe I saved the most important question for last. Since we're talking name, image, and likeness, I'm 6'2", been a broadcaster for a long time. I mean, I got experience. How are we working on any broadcasting name, image, and likeness deals? Like, how's that go?
100% no.
You want to think about it at all, or?
I wish. I mean, as a 58-year-old 6'8" pick and pop foreman, I don't think I haven't on all these airplane flights. Imagine what that NIL figure could be.
You're born at the wrong time.
No, this is a young person's game, Jason.
We missed our window, didn't we?
by a long shot.
Chris, thank you so much. I know we will talk again in the future. I hope people get more and more educated about this. I hope this help people out there. But your work with whether it's San Jose State, I know St. Mary's, SMU, you reference, certainly with Sacramento State. This is ever evolving. People need to pay attention to this, and I think the Hornet future looks bright. Chris, thank you so much for the time and the insight, and would love to do it again in the future.
Jason, I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. It was a lot of insight there from Chris Schomman and stuff I didn't know. I was glad to catch up on. Hopefully it was informative for you guys as well. As far as this week goes, the Hornets are on the road to Cal Poly. This is a team that has really struggled. You know the Hornets have struggled. I think this is an opportunity, if the Hornets can put some things together, can find a way to bounce back, get another victory, and head into the Causeway Classic with just a tiny bit of momentum. Davis sure looks good. They had a great victory a week ago in Missoula, and they've got the showdown for the conference this weekend. They'll be at home taking on Montana State. Basically, the winner of that will win the Big Sky Conference. So Sacramento State at Cal Poly this week. We will recap that, look ahead to the Causeway, and much more next week. But we do thank you for listening to the podcast each and every week, and our thanks again to Chris Schomman, the executive director of the Hornet Collective. Now, how can you get involved? I'm sure a lot of you want to know that, and I think that's important. So to learn more about this and ways you can possibly help, there's two ways to give directly to the collective. There's ways to give to the Hornet NIL program through the Hornet Exchange and the Hornet Collective. But the best way and the easiest way to get more information on this is go to hornetsports.com, click on the NIL button. You'll see it. It's really easy right there on the website. So if you want to learn more ways you can help the program, hornetsports.com, click on the NIL button, and you'll have it right there. So again, thank you to everyone for listening, and we'll be back again next week for another edition of the Stingers Up Sacramento State Football Podcast.